everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to get into an article called Back to Africa by W.E.B. Dubois, and this article can be found in the Century magazine on page 539. Again, it's Back to Africa by W.E.B. Dubois, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, I was looking through articles, Back to Africa articles, and doing research about the different people who address the Back to Africa movement that we talk about often in our community. And I came across this article by W.B. Dubois, and instead of being an article where he supports a going back to Africa movement or setting the groundworks for a Back to Africa movement, it was actually an article sort of like the rise and fall of Marcus Garvey in a few pages. And it was more a criticism of Marcus Garvey's movement instead of supporting or encouraging a movement that Marcus Garvey was proposing. However, the article was very interesting, very important, because there are many leaders or people in our community nowadays who follow the same philosophies as Marcus Garvey, and not only do they follow his same philosophies, they also mirror the flaws that W.E.B. Dubois pointed out in this article. So I encourage everyone to pick up this article. Again, it's Back to Africa by W.E.B. Dubois, and you can find it in the Century magazine, and it starts on page 539. Now, the first thing that W.B. Dubois talked about in this article was the discourse of race. Now, he doesn't put it in those words, but I put it in those words because of the previous videos that I've done. But W.B. Dubois talks about the fact that Marcus Garvey came from Jamaica to Harlem. And when he came to Harlem from Jamaica, he brought with him his knowledge of the race problem that they have in Jamaica, and he tried to bring the same problems and the same intricacies and the same discursive practices in the discourse of race in Jamaica to the U.S. And that was a problem, because I'm not an expert on race relations in Jamaica, but from this article, it seems that in Jamaica, the problem that they have with race relations there is not only between dark-skinned blacks and white people, but there's a big problem with dark-skinned blacks and mulattoes. And it seems that in Jamaica, the mulattoes are the oppressive forces now, or back in 1930s, which is probably now as well, because things in race relations do not change very fast. As we know that back in the 1930s, there was a Jim Crow in the U.S., and right now, in 2017, there's a new Jim Crow. So things do not change that much. They just take on new names. But so Marcus Garvey brought in the discourse of race relations in Jamaica to the U.S., where in Jamaica the mulattoes have mixed so much in with the whites there that the mulattoes are the oppressive forces in Jamaica. So when Marcus Garvey came to the U.S. and brought this idea of a Back to Africa movement, his primary supporters at first were the West Indians in Harlem. And he would give his speeches, and I imagine he was an eloquent speaker because people like to listen to him and get his message. And he addressed a problem that in the U.S. was labeled the Negro problem. They called the problem of race relations between blacks and whites in the U.S. the Negro problem, and he had a new outlook on it. He wasn't talking about segregation and or integration or getting along with the whites. He proposed that black people get together and move back to Africa and start a new nation in Africa, where he was going to be the emperor of that nation. But his talk about economics, doing for self, not relying on white people for anything, not looking for equality, black people like to hear those types of things. However, he would also go in on light-skinned blacks and biracial blacks and mixed blacks, and in this article they call them mulattoes. He would go in on those, which in Jamaica that would be fine if they were the oppressive forces. However, in America, in the US, the mulattoes weren't the oppressive forces. Anybody in the US that had one drop of black blood in them, which was known and they couldn't pass, they were oppressed just like the rest of the blacks, just like the rest of the Negroes back in that time period. So when he would talk about lighter skinned blacks or mixed blacks, like he was excluding a large group of the population. Now, the way that we look at light-skinned and dark-skinned blacks now, 2017, in the US, is very much different than someone from another country looking at dark-skinned blacks. For example, or not just dark-skinned blacks, but brown skin, light skin, because if you talk to someone from Africa, or we can take Langston Hughes' example, when he went back to Africa. In the US, we look at Langston Hughes and we'll say he's a black man, period, end of story. However, when he went to Africa, Africans said, no, you're not black. And no matter what he would say, or no matter how much he would try to explain to him that he is black, with his wavy hair and his caramel complected skin color, he was not considered black. And that's the difference. So when you're talking about separating from America and going to some other country to live out, just to separate from white people, because that's, just to be clear, when you talk about separating from America, the reasoning behind it, which I can do in a whole new video, because there's a lot of reasons why a black person would want to leave the United States and start out a new life in some other country, which is called expatriation, which I don't understand why that discussion is not going on more than the Back to Africa discussions. However, there's a lot of reasons why black people would want to up and move to another country and start a new life. However, okay, back to this article. So Marcus Garvey, he excluded a lot of the black population when he would talk about his Back to Africa movement. Now, it's clear that he mirrored a lot of speakers today, because he got the base of his support at the beginning were Jamaicans and West Indians, and then his word got out to black Americans, and he raised a lot of money from the community. He raised a lot of money from his speeches and activities that he did in the community, and according to this article, the majority of his support came from the uneducated, the unlettered, the working class, and mostly the poor black people. They gave I think it was a monthly contribution of like 35 cents a month or something like that, or whatever they could give. They were supporting his Back to Africa movement. Now, Marcus Garvey may have been an eloquent speaker. He may have been telling these people what they wanted to hear, and he was putting on a show which a certain amount of the population would accept and a certain amount would not. But they were giving him money, and he raised money, and he was not a businessman. Now, I question this because he may have been a businessman, because there are, in other articles, they address that he committed fraud upon those who were supporting him monetarily. This article doesn't mention anything about that, but obviously he began to purchase ships to take the multitudes of black people back to Africa, and he was looking at Liberia. And on my previous video that I did on Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movements, I addressed the problems that he faced in Liberia. And in this period, I'm talking about the problems that he faced here in the U.S., according to W.B. Dubois. But he bought some ships to take blacks back to Africa, but these ships were in terrible condition. They couldn't make trips anywhere. They were ships that were already docked for good, that were no longer in use. So, and he bought these ships for more than 2 and 3 times the price than what the ships were worth. So the reason why I question that is because I don't see him actually buying those ships. I see him wheeling and dealing so he can show his followers receipts of what he was doing. However, I think that he never had the intentions of following through with his Back to Africa movement anyway. Like, I just don't think that he was serious about it, because I don't see why it would be so difficult for a movement like that to take place in this time period, when actually it was done earlier with the American Colonization Society, where white people gathered a whole bunch of free blacks and slaves, gathered them all together and colonized Liberia, which is where Liberia that we knew back then how it came into being. They were expatriates. I don't want to say expatriates, but they were free blacks and slaves who were picked by slave masters, white people who wanted to take care of, and they had a Negro problem back then, and they shipped a whole bunch of black people back to Liberia to colonize Liberia. So I don't understand, if Marcus Garvey was real, and if he had as much money as he claimed to have, to raise, why he couldn't do the same thing. My answer to that is he had no intentions of doing that. However, another thing that W.B. Du Bois addressed that was very interesting was this notion of, he said that Marcus Garvey didn't go so far as to call himself King Garvey. However, he did have people addressing him as Your Majesty. He still had thrones that he sat on, and he had these big flamboyant general clothes with we've seen the pictures. Most of the famous pictures of Marcus Garvey shows him in his big general hat and sword and everything like that. It's a show that many black people like, but when you get down to business and money and talking about moving and starting a new settlement, you can't have that. So he was pandering to ignorant black folks that like all of these names and titles and positions and things like that, because it diverts you from getting down to the business and the numbers and the hardships that you're going to have to face if you take expatriatism seriously. And this is when W.B. Du Bois started going in on Marcus Garvey, because soon when the black Americans got interested into his movement, that's when they were asking about, and they even went through the papers, they started asking about, where's your plans? Like, they wanted some concrete plans. You know, what is your reasoning behind this? You know, they started asking about serious questions like, how is it going to come to fruition, the longevity. They started asking the real questions, to which he had no answers. Which some of our leaders today talk about schools and things that they want to establish, and they raise a lot of money among black Americans who don't want to ask any questions. They like to hear the gift of gab. The speaker says everything that they want to hear, so they reach into their hard-earned money and they donate, and then nothing happens. And then there's all these different problems that come up when it comes to the purchase of land and property and implementing the school or whatever it is you're trying to establish. And then when you listen to the person who's trying to establish the school, he has a lot of problems with race, light skin, mulattoes, albinos, interracial relationships, and all of that stuff. And then there's all kind of practices and things that they want to put in place that are illegal. And Marcus Garvey found himself in illegal practices when the U.S. investigated his Back to Africa movement, and eventually he got deported back to Jamaica. However, we were talking about these titles and this flamboyancy that he was putting out in front of black people as a show to continue with his donations. But when the black Americans started to ask those serious questions, that's when his Back to Africa movement here in the U.S. started to fail. So then I found it interesting that W.B. Du Bois said that Marcus Garvey then called a meeting with the Ku Klux Klan. And I've heard some people say, well, that's reasonable because the Ku Klux Klan were the enemies. So if you have enemies, it's good to meet with the enemy to discuss different terms and things of that nature. However, the Ku Klux Klan, as terrible as they were during that time period, they were not the enemy. However, they were, when we look at the Ku Klux Klan, they got their grand dragons, their grand cyclops, their sheets, and all of that nonsense, which was the same thing that Marcus Garvey was trying to do with his movement. All of these costumes and all of these titles and all of this nonsense, and the Ku Klux Klan, they don't have your interests at heart. So I don't see what is there to talk about. So W.B. Du Bois looked at it and he said, well, one thing that Marcus Garvey could discuss with the Ku Klux Klan is for the Ku Klux Klan to begin to terrorize the South again, which they like to do, to terrorize the blacks in the South. That way he could swoop in to the South with his eloquence and his Back to Africa movement, and then get the support of the blacks in the South, because Marcus Garvey was in Harlem and had support of most of the West Indians and some black Americans in the North. Even Malcolm X's father was considered a Garveyite. But he had some support in the North, but he didn't have any support in the South. So he could have the Ku Klux Klan go and terrorize the South, then he can swoop in with his eloquence and his speech and then start to exploit the blacks in the South. And it never came to fruition. So this Back to Africa movement, and W.B. Dubois he talked about why a Back to Africa movement would be very tasteful and very alluring to many blacks during this time. And then he talked about how Marcus Garvey gained prominence, how he got his name in the papers and everything. But then when the real questions came forth about how is this going to be established, and then the bad business practices, the bad position that she put in people, the ignorance that was spewed forth when in his speeches, when it started to reach larger crowds, and his just so when you start to create a movement, you need to know the audience that you're talking to. And I said that in some of my other videos. It's all about the messenger, the author, the message that is being given, and the audience that you're targeting. So if you come out with a whole bunch of nonsense to an audience that you're talking the nonsense about, you're not going to move very far. You're not going to get many donations, and then whatever it is, whatever movement you're trying to put forth is just going to fall flat, which happened to this Back to Africa movement. So I'm going to do some research to see if I can find some speeches actually given by Marcus Garvey to hear in his own words what he used to talk about. But I recommend that everyone get this Back to Africa article by W.B. Dubois, again on page 539 in the Century magazine. It's a very interesting article, and it can give you some insights on how the black Americans during that time period viewed the Back to Africa movement. And one thing I want to note is that it was taken seriously. Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement, it was taken seriously at first. Aside from all the flamboyancy and all of his talk about separating and insulting mulattoes and mixed blacks from dark-skinned blacks and things like that, it was his message, however, was taken seriously, because during this time period, black people were being terrorized by white people, so they were going to take any suggestions on fixing the Negro problem seriously. So it was taken seriously, and this article is a serious criticism of that movement. Again, this is Jason Williams with Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.